Right guys, welcome to a new video. This is about learning and performance, and it's part of our skill acquisition in sport series. We're going to, in this lesson, answer two questions, or at least we're going to try. What is learning and how do we measure learning? What is learning and how do we actually measure learning? So, can you do any of these things? Can you ride a bike or bake a cake? Can you do maths? Can you sink a free throw? If you can, I know there was a time when you couldn't do that. So how did you go about picking up those skills? How did you go about acquiring those skills? What happened in between point A when you couldn't do it and point B when you could? We're going to say that that is learning. The process that takes you from not being able to do something to finally being able to do something. And to give a definition, we're going to say this. Learning may then be considered to be a more or less permanent change in performance associated with experiences. Learning is a more or less permanent change in performance associated with experience. We're talking about something that happens over a period of time. And it's happening maybe in your brain, in your body. You're picking up these skills over a period of time, and you're getting to a place where that skill is more or less permanent. And it's associated, as the quotation says here, associated with experiences. That is, maybe you watched somebody demonstrate, or somebody told you how to perform a free throw, for example, and you practiced and you had a go. And eventually those experiences somehow accumulated and somehow were processed by you, and eventually meant that you could then perform that skill. But why then is learning so hard to actually measure? Why is learning hard to measure? And the reason is this: because learning is basically invisible. Whatever it is that's going on inside your brain, inside your mind, inside your body, whatever it is that's happening is basically invisible. The processing and the process that you go through from not being able to perform a skill to then being able to perform it is basically invisible. So in order to work out whether or not you've learned something, we need to look at something we can see. And what we can see is your performance. Because performances are, obviously, visible. But they suffer from the problem that they are just one-offs. They're just in the moment. And so in order to be able to tell whether or not we've learned something, we have to look at performance. And then we have to assume that that performance can tell us something about whether or not you've learned. They're not the same thing, but obviously they're related. Singer says this: the process of learning, you know, that invisible thing that's going on in your body or your brain, the process of learning must be inferred. That means read back into or assumed. The process of learning must be inferred on the basis of observations of change in performance. So if you want to measure learning, it's very difficult, in fact it's impossible strictly speaking, because learning itself is invisible. We have to simply infer that learning has happened if we can see performances getting better over time. So if performances are improving, we are going to read into that learning has happened in between the times when we've asked somebody to perform. So for example, if I were to ask you to perform a free throw, let's say I asked you for the first time you'd ever attempted it. You wouldn't necessarily know how to do it. You wouldn't necessarily have the coordination to be able to perform a good free throw. And then eventually over time, if I coached you or I taught you, showed you how to do it and gave you demonstrations and you practiced and you worked hard and you thought about it and so on, eventually you were able to do it. If I were to ask you again 6 months down the line, can you do a free throw, and you were able to then perform it, I could assume that in that period of time you'd actually learned something, even though I couldn't actually see the learning taking place. So here's a quick thought. What kinds of things help us to infer learning? What kinds of performances are we talking about here? Well, there are various different kinds, and depending on what the skill is we're hoping to have learned, we will choose a different way of performing or evidencing that learning has happened. So we could do exams, we could do tests, and those would be really useful if what we're learning is commonly referred to sort of academic learning or knowledge. If we were looking at things much more to do with sort of skill-based things, so sporting skills in our context, we might ask somebody to compete against somebody else. We might ask them to, for example, play a sport against a particular opponent and see if they could beat them. Maybe it was an opponent that had beaten them in the past and now they're able to win. That would indicate, that performance could potentially indicate, it wouldn't be absolutely certain, but it could potentially indicate that we'd learned something. Another really good way of doing it would be demonstration. So we were talking about free throws. I could say to you, after 6 months of your practicing, I could say to you, right, I want you to demonstrate that you've learned how to free throw. And you could take a shot and down it goes, nothing but net. And I could infer that you'd learned something. It would be better, in fact, if I could get you to do several demonstrations so that I could be even more secure and confident that you'd learnt it and that it wasn't a fluke. Because, sometimes a performance could be a bit of a fluke. It can be a bit of a one-off, as we were saying. So we can't necessarily infer from a single performance, we can't infer too securely that learning has happened. But if we have multiple performances of a particular skill, we can then begin to infer relatively confidently that learning has actually happened. So learning and performance are not exactly the same thing, but they are of course related. I hope that's been helpful. Thanks for watching.